Everyone in the courtroom was sure that the outcome of the case was a foregone conclusion. The judge did not hide his mockery, and the prosecutor was preparing for an easy victory. But once Ivanka Trump spoke, the situation changed. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. The courtroom buzzed with the quiet murmur of voices, the soft scratching of pens against notepads, and the occasional click of cameras capturing every movement. A sea of journalists, political analysts, and business executives filled the gallery, eager to witness the trial unfold. This was more than just a case. It was a spectacle, a public showdown with one of the most recognizable figures in American business. Ivanka Trump sat at the defense table, her posture immaculate, her face an unreadable mask of calm. She was dressed in a tailored navy suit, the epitome of understated power. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a sleek bun, her makeup minimal but impeccable. If she felt the weight of the accusations against her, she didn't show it. The judge, an older man with decades of legal experience, settled into his seat and surveyed the room. He was known for his sharp wit and no-nonsense demeanor, and though he had not yet spoken, the faintest trace of amusement played at the corners of his mouth. He had seen powerful figures crumble in his courtroom before. He had no reason to believe today would be any different. The prosecutor, a man in his 40s with a commanding presence and a sharp gaze, rose from his seat and walked toward the jury box. He exuded confidence, the kind that came from knowing the public was on his side. He cleared his throat and let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and authoritative, "we are gathered here today because of one simple truth. No one is above the law. Not politicians, not celebrities, and certainly not billionaires who think they can manipulate the system to their advantage." The statement was met with approving nods from the jury, and a ripple of whispers spread through the audience. The prosecutor allowed himself a small smirk before continuing. For years, Ivanka Trump has used legal loopholes to avoid paying what she rightfully owes. She has hidden behind technicalities, exploiting the flaws in our system while hard-working Americans bear the burden. Today, we present clear, undeniable evidence that her company engaged in deliberate financial misrepresentation, evading millions in tax obligations. The documents, the transactions, the timelines, they all point to one conclusion: guilt. He turned to the judge, then back to the jury. "But don't take my word for it. The evidence will speak for itself." The courtroom remained silent as he walked to his table, neatly arranging the documents he would later present. He was in control. The judge finally spoke, his voice even but laced with something resembling amusement. "Miss Trump, do you understand the charges against you?" Ivanka lifted her chin slightly, her expression unreadable. "Yes, Your Honor." Her voice was steady, clear, devoid of any defensiveness. The judge nodded and glanced at the prosecutor. "You may proceed." The prosecutor wasted no time. He launched into a detailed explanation of the case, gesturing to large printed exhibits, pointing to financial records, piecing together a narrative in which Ivanka Trump was not just a wealthy businesswoman, but a calculated manipulator of legal gray areas. In the audience, journalists scribbled furiously, anticipating tomorrow's headlines. Political commentators exchanged knowing looks. They had seen this before, powerful people finally being held accountable. Ivanka sat motionless, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She did not interrupt, did not shift uncomfortably, did not offer so much as a raised eyebrow in response. She simply listened. The prosecutor pressed on, his voice growing more impassioned. "This is not just about money," he declared. It's about justice. It's about fairness. It's about making sure that when you look at the person next to you, your neighbor, your coworker, your friend, you know that they are playing by the same rules as everyone else. And if we allow Miss Trump to escape accountability today, what message does that send? A murmur of agreement rippled through the courtroom. The judge let the statement settle before finally shifting his gaze to Ivanka. Miss Trump, would you like to make an opening statement? A brief silence followed, as if the room itself had paused to see what she would do. Ivanka Trump slowly leaned forward, folding her hands together with meticulous precision. With all due respect, she said, her tone cool, controlled, and unmistakably firm, I'd like to thank the prosecution for their very dramatic interpretation of reality. The words hung in the air for a moment, and something in the courtroom shifted. The judge's faint smirk disappeared. The prosecutor's self-assurance faltered, if only for a second. For the first time since the trial had begun, the momentum had changed. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Journalists exchanging glances, pens scratching hurried notes. Ivanka Trump remained composed, her hands still resting neatly on the table before her. She had not raised her voice, had not displayed any outward defiance, yet the air in the room felt different. Something had shifted. The prosecutor recovered quickly. He smoothed his tie, took a breath, and forced a small, knowing smile. He had faced defiant defendants before, people who thought they could outmaneuver the law. It never ended well for them. The defense is entitled to their theatrics, he said, his tone carrying an air of practiced patience. But this courtroom does not deal in interpretations of reality. It deals in facts. He turned towards the jury, his voice steady, each word carefully measured. We have gathered undeniable proof that Miss Trump knowingly exploited legal loopholes to avoid financial obligations. Her company's records, he gestured to a thick folder on the table, paint a very clear picture of tax evasion hidden behind a sophisticated corporate structure. He walked slowly across the floor, letting his words settle. These are not errors. These are not misunderstandings. This was a deliberate, calculated effort to circumvent the law, and today we will prove it. There was an unmistakable confidence in his delivery. He was a man who had won cases just like this before, a man who had stood before juries and dismantled defenses that seemed, at first, solid. The jury watched him intently, their expressions neutral but engaged. Ivanka remained still, watching, listening, absorbing. The prosecutor reached for a document and held it up. This, he said, is a financial statement submitted by Miss Trump's company 2 years ago. It directly contradicts a more recent filing, where the numbers, he paused for effect, mysteriously change. Now, defense might argue that this was an oversight, that mistakes happen. But I ask you, how often do mistakes conveniently reduce tax liabilities by millions of dollars? He let the question hang in the air. The judge, still leaning slightly back in his chair, observed without comment. He had seen enough trials to know when a lawyer believed he had already won. Ivanka finally moved. She reached for a document of her own, sliding it across the table before standing, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She adjusted her jacket, then looked directly at the judge. If I may, Your Honor. The judge gestured for her to continue. His curiosity piqued. She stepped forward, stopping just short of the prosecutor, who did not move aside but tilted his head, watching her carefully. She held up the document she had placed on the table. This, she said, is a copy of that same financial statement. What the prosecution failed to mention, either through oversight or selective presentation, is that the revised numbers account for changes in tax law that went into effect the following year. Meaning, she continued, her voice unwavering, not only were these filings legal, but they were required by regulation. A murmur spread through the room and the prosecutor's jaw visibly tightened. He opened his mouth, but before he could respond, Ivanka raised a finger, flipping to a highlighted section of the document. This law, Your Honor, was passed by Congress in the fiscal year before the updated filing. The prosecution claims my company manipulated the system. In reality, we followed the system's own rules. She let the words sink in. The judge reached for the document, adjusting his glasses as he scanned the page. His fingers tapped lightly against the desk, a subtle but noticeable sign of reconsideration. The prosecutor quickly moved to regain control. "That may be so," he said, his voice sharper now. "But that doesn't change the fact that Miss Trump has a long history of exploiting these kinds of loopholes. This is just one instance of many." He flipped through his papers, pulling out another document. This is an internal memo from within Miss Trump's organization, explicitly discussing ways to minimize tax burdens. If that's not proof of intent, I don't know what is. He turned to the jury again. Let's not be naive. This isn't about following the law, it's about bending it until it barely resembles what it was meant to be. Ivanka remained unfazed. She clasped her hands in front of her, her expression calm. "I'd like to address that memo," she said. The judge nodded, allowing her to proceed. She walked to the defense table, picking up another document and holding it up. "This is a similar memo," she said, "from a Fortune 500 company, dated the same year. In it, they discuss, almost word for word, the exact same strategy." She turned to the jury. "This is called tax planning. It is something every major corporation does. It is not illegal, nor is it unusual. The only reason I'm sitting in this courtroom today is because my last name is Trump." Silence. The prosecutor opened his mouth, but the words didn't come immediately. He exhaled sharply, flipping through his papers again, searching for the next move. The judge leaned forward now, his amusement from earlier replaced by intrigue. The energy in the room had shifted. The jury, once a passive audience to the prosecution's confident performance, now looked to Ivanka with newfound interest. The prosecutor clenched his jaw and forced a measured response. "The fact remains," he said, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence, "that the public has a right to expect fairness. Even if the law allows for these actions, does that make them right?" Ivanka met his gaze. "That's not a legal argument," she said simply. The prosecutor said nothing. The judge tapped his fingers against the bench. "I'm going to allow the defense to continue this line of argument," he said after a pause. "Let's see where this goes." Ivanka nodded, returning to her seat. For the first time since the trial had begun, she wasn't just defending herself. She was taking control. The courtroom was no longer a stage where the prosecution dictated the performance. The carefully constructed narrative of inevitable guilt had begun to fray at the edges, and the person responsible for that shift sat calmly, her expression unreadable. Ivanka Trump had not raised her voice, had not resorted to dramatics, yet her quiet, methodical dismantling of the case had changed everything. The prosecutor, still gripping the papers in front of him, forced himself to maintain composure. He had built his case on the assumption that his opponent would play defense, not take the offensive. He needed to regain control before the jury started questioning the very premise of the case. He took a breath and turned back to the exhibits behind him, shifting his strategy. "Let's step back for a moment," he said, his tone measured, as if he were a professor explaining something to students who had missed the lesson. "We're getting lost in technicalities, but the facts remain. The defendant, through her company, made deliberate financial decisions designed to obscure liability. It's all here in black and white." He gestured to another large printed exhibit, a timeline of transactions, figures shifting from one account to another, moving across jurisdictions. "The defense would like you to believe that because something isn't outright illegal, it is inherently justifiable. But let's be clear, if an action is taken to avoid legal scrutiny, does that not suggest wrongdoing?" He let the question hang, looking at the jury, gauging their reactions. Ivanka exhaled softly and stood again, moving with the same deliberate calm she had displayed since the trial began. She walked toward the prosecution's exhibit, eyes scanning it as if considering it for the first time. Then she turned to the judge. "Your Honor, may I?" The judge nodded, and she stepped closer, gesturing toward the timeline. "I'd like to examine this timeline the prosecution has presented." She took a step back, as if evaluating a painting. "At first glance, this might look like something suspicious. Numbers moving, transactions shifting. But what the prosecution fails to mention is that this is standard financial structuring for any corporation of this scale." She turned back toward the jury, clasping her hands behind her back. "Apple does it, Amazon does it, Tesla does it. Every multinational corporation engages in similar strategies to ensure compliance with complex, ever-changing regulations. The prosecution wants you to believe this is evidence of guilt, when in reality it's simply evidence of how business operates." The prosecutor stiffened, clearly ready to interject, but she wasn't finished. "And let's talk about the phrase the prosecution just used, to avoid legal scrutiny. That is not what happened here. Compliance departments exist for this exact reason. My company did not avoid scrutiny. We followed the law. The real issue is that the law itself is inconsistent." She turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, this entire case is based on the idea that my company violated financial regulations. But let's take a closer look at those regulations, shall we?" She moved back to the defense table, picking up a thick legal document and flipping through the pages. "This law, which the prosecution has built their argument on, was originally written decades ago, before modern digital finance even existed. The language is outdated, the framework is inefficient, and, worst of all," she turned a page and looked back up, "it contradicts itself." A hushed murmur spread through the courtroom. The prosecutor let out a sharp breath. "That's nonsense." Ivanka lifted an eyebrow. "Is it?" She stepped toward the table again, flipping to another section. "If my company had followed every clause written here to the letter, we would have been in violation of another federal mandate regarding corporate tax allocation." She tapped the page. "So, tell me, Your Honor, should I follow this law or the one that directly opposes it?" The judge's smirk had completely vanished now. He reached for his glasses and began to skim the document. His lips pressed together, and for the first time that day, he did not immediately respond. The prosecutor, sensing the shift, hurried to regain the upper hand. "That's an attempt to deflect responsibility. The law may have inefficiencies, but it is still the law. Your company knowingly operated within a gray area." Ivanka turned to him, tilting her head slightly. "That is precisely my point." The courtroom, which had moments ago been confident in her downfall, was now listening in silence. The judge leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. Ivanka flipped another page. "The law, like physics, should be based on principles. and principles should never contradict themselves. But this case, it's built entirely on contradictions. She turned back to the prosecutor. You assumed I wouldn't understand legal jargon, but I don't need legal jargon to win this case. I just need logic. The judge tapped his fingers against the bench, the rhythm slow, thoughtful. The prosecutor swallowed, flipping through his notes quickly. This is a distraction. Is it? Ivanka interrupted, flipping to yet another highlighted section. Because Section 42.3 of this very law states that regulatory changes affecting corporate finance require a 2-year compliance window before enforcement, which means that the actions my company took at the time they were taken were in full accordance with the law. The judge's eyes moved swiftly across the page. His expression shifted, his brow furrowing slightly. The prosecutor opened his mouth to counter, but nothing came out. Ivanka wasn't finished. And while we're talking about precedent, let's discuss Smithson v. Tech Corp., a case decided in this very court. The ruling was clear. No company can be penalized for operating in a regulatory gray area when existing laws don't adequately cover emergent industries. She set the document down, folding her arms. So, Your Honor, are we here to apply justice, or to punish progress because it doesn't fit within outdated rules? Silence. The judge exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. He had entered this courtroom fully in control, certain that Ivanka Trump was just another executive trying to manipulate the system to her advantage. But now the balance had shifted. The prosecutor clenched his jaw, flipping through his notes frantically. He had walked into this trial confident that he held all the cards. Now it was becoming clear that he had underestimated his opponent. The weight of the moment hung in the air, thick and undeniable. A few hours ago, the courtroom had been filled with certainty. Certainty that the case was open and shut, that the prosecution's evidence was overwhelming, that Ivanka Trump was simply another wealthy executive who had finally met a system she couldn't outmaneuver. Now, that certainty was gone. Ivanka remained standing, her posture unwavering, her expression unshaken. Across from her, the prosecutor's once polished composure had begun to fracture. His fingers gripped the edges of his notes a little too tightly. His once smooth tone had developed a subtle edge. The jury, who had once hung on his every word, was now watching her instead. She had done more than defend herself. She had made them question everything they had assumed to be true. The prosecutor cleared his throat, forcing his voice to remain steady. This argument is nothing more than an attempt to deflect responsibility, he said, pacing slightly, as if movement could restore his control over the room. The defense wants us to believe that because the law isn't perfect, it simply doesn't apply. That's not how justice works. He stopped and turned sharply toward the jury, his gaze sweeping across them. Ask yourselves this. If we allow corporations to decide for themselves which regulations are valid and which are outdated, what happens next? Do we let every company write its own rulebook? The words were delivered with precision, but their impact was not the same as before. The jury did not nod in automatic agreement. Some of them were still staring at Ivanka, their expressions contemplative, considering. Ivanka slowly walked back toward her seat, placing both hands on the defense table before looking at the judge. With respect, Your Honor, that is a misrepresentation of what I said. She turned back toward the jury. My argument is not that the law doesn't apply. My argument is that the law contradicts itself. That is an important distinction, one the prosecution keeps trying to blur. She gestured toward the thick legal documents on the table. These laws are meant to regulate industries that have changed dramatically over the years. If a company is told to follow one regulation only to be penalized because another contradicts it, then we have a broken system. And I ask you, if the law is unclear, is it just to punish those who follow one set of rules over another? She let the words linger. The judge, who had spent most of the day watching her with bemused skepticism, was no longer leaning back in his chair. He was listening. The prosecutor could feel the shift happening, but he wasn't ready to let it take hold. He walked swiftly back to his table, retrieving a new folder. "If the defense is finished trying to turn this into a debate on legal philosophy," he said, flipping through the pages, "I'd like to bring the focus back to the specifics of this case." He turned back toward the jury. The facts are simple. Miss Trump and her company moved assets in a way that reduced their tax burden, knowing full well that they were operating in a gray area. He pulled a single sheet from the folder and held it up. This is an internal email from Miss Trump's accounting team discussing concerns over potential legal challenges. They knew this could be seen as improper, yet they proceeded anyway. He placed the document onto the evidence screen, where the text was projected for all to see. Ivanka barely glanced at it before speaking. "Your Honor, I'd like to request that the prosecution also display the full context of that email." The prosecutor hesitated. Ivanka remained composed. "If we're going to examine internal company discussions," she said, "then let's be transparent." The second half of that email, which is conveniently missing from this exhibit, states that all financial decisions were reviewed by legal counsel and found to be fully compliant. The prosecutor's mouth pressed into a thin line. Ivanka turned toward the jury again. "This is what I mean when I say the prosecution is misrepresenting reality. They present a partial truth, hoping you won't notice what's missing. But the truth is, my company followed the law as it was written, not as they wish it had been written." The prosecutor exhaled sharply. "This is semantics," he said. "It doesn't change the fact that the company took actions to avoid liability." Ivanka's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "You mean the same way every other major corporation does?" She tilted her head slightly. "The prosecution wants to punish me for playing by the rules they don't like. But rules are rules, even when they're inconvenient." A hush settled over the room. The prosecutor's frustration became more visible with each passing second. He had started this case with the confidence of a man who knew the outcome before the first word was spoken. Now he was scrambling, searching for an angle that had not yet been dismantled. Ivanka sat back down, as if she had already predicted this moment would come. The judge exhaled, rubbing his temple as he looked down at the documents in front of him. "This is becoming more complicated than it appeared," he admitted. The prosecutor clenched his jaw. "Your Honor, we cannot allow technicalities to override the spirit of the law." The judge raised an eyebrow. "You're arguing against technicalities when your entire case depends on them?" A few journalists in the gallery exchanged glances, their pens pausing mid-sentence. The prosecutor forced a thin smile. "My point, Your Honor, is that the law is meant to hold people accountable. It exists for a reason." Ivanka's voice remained steady. "And yet, the case you're trying to make is built on selectively applied logic." The judge glanced at both of them before leaning back again. "Miss Trump," he said, his voice slow, deliberate, "I have to admit, I expected this trial to go differently." Ivanka didn't respond. She didn't need to. The judge sighed. "Proceed." For the first time that day, it was the prosecution, not the defense, on unstable ground. The prosecutor knew the case was slipping through his fingers, but he refused to let go. He had come into this courtroom believing that Ivanka Trump was just another executive who thought her wealth and influence could shield her from the consequences of her actions. He had seen it before. Billionaires who believed they were untouchable, whose arrogance led them to think they could talk their way out of accountability. But this was different. This wasn't arrogance. This was control. She had not come here unprepared, nor had she underestimated the system she was up against. If anything, it was the system that had underestimated her. He squared his shoulders, flipping through his notes, searching for a way to regain lost ground. He needed something irrefutable, something that could shake her composure, something that could remind the jury why they were here in the first place. That was when he found it. He turned back to the judge, lifting a folder from the table and holding it up for the room to see. "Your Honor," he announced, his voice loud and clear, "the prosecution has new evidence." The words sent a ripple through the courtroom. Journalists leaned forward, their pens poised over their notepads. The jury, which had begun to glance more at the defense than the prosecution, turned their eyes back to him. The judge adjusted his glasses and frowned slightly. "New evidence?" His voice carried an unmistakable note of skepticism. "This trial has been in preparation for months. Why am I hearing about this now?" The prosecutor strode toward the bench, setting the folder down with just enough force to make a statement. "This document," he said, "proves beyond any doubt that Miss Trump knowingly disregarded regulations." He turned to the jury, his confidence restored. "It's all here, in black and white." Ivanka did not move, did not shift in her seat, did not so much as blink. She simply watched as the judge reached for the folder and flipped it open. Silence filled the room as he scanned the contents. A long pause. Then the judge's expression changed, slightly but noticeably. He closed the folder, placed it down on the bench, and looked up. "Miss Trump," he said, "do you have anything to say about this?" Ivanka finally moved. She stood, adjusted her jacket, and stepped forward with the same ease she carried into boardrooms and negotiations. She didn't rush. She didn't panic. She simply looked at the judge, then at the prosecutor, and exhaled softly. "Of course, Your Honor." She gestured toward the document. "That's fascinating." She let the words hang for a moment before continuing. "Considering that this report was written after the lawsuit was filed." A wave of murmurs broke through the courtroom. The prosecutor tensed. Ivanka turned toward the jury, clasping her hands in front of her. If this document was as crucial as the prosecution claims, why did it only appear now? Why was it not included in their original filing? The answer is simple. She turned back to the prosecutor. "It's not evidence. It's an attempt to patch the holes in an argument that's already sinking." The prosecutor took a step forward, his expression hard. "That's a bold claim, Miss Trump," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "Are you suggesting that the prosecution fabricated evidence?" Ivanka tilted her head slightly. "I'm suggesting," she said, "that desperation is not a legal strategy." The courtroom stilled. The prosecutor's jaw tightened. Ivanka turned back toward the judge. "Your Honor, I request that this so-called evidence be dismissed on the grounds that it was introduced at the last minute, with no prior disclosure to the defense. It is not part of the official case record, and allowing it now would be highly irregular." The judge leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. "Counselor," he said, addressing the prosecutor, "I'm inclined to agree. You cannot introduce evidence this late into the proceedings without proper disclosure." The prosecutor clenched his fists at his sides. "Your Honor, this document provides crucial context." The judge sighed, tapping his fingers against the bench. "No, this document provides a last-minute attempt to salvage a failing argument." He pushed the folder aside. "It will not be considered." The prosecutor's face darkened, but he said nothing. Ivanka remained standing, her expression as poised as ever. The judge turned back toward her. "Miss Trump," he said, his voice measured, "I must admit, I underestimated you." The words sent another ripple through the room. Journalists exchanged glances, their pens moving furiously across their notepads. "This court entered today with the belief that your actions were reckless, perhaps even illegal," the judge continued. "But after reviewing the arguments presented, I see that is not the case." A few gasps cut through the silence. The prosecutor stiffened. The judge nodded toward him. "The prosecution has failed to establish a solid foundation for their claims. The evidence they have provided is, at best, inconsistent, at worst, misleading." He shot a glance at the opposing counsel, who looked visibly defeated. The judge took one final look at the room before delivering his verdict. "This court finds no grounds to proceed with this case further." He turned to Ivanka. "Miss Trump, you're free to go." The opposing lawyer's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to object, but no words came out. Ivanka simply smirked. She had already known how this would end. The words hung in the air, settling over the courtroom like a thick, suffocating fog. The judge's ruling had been final, his tone absolute. There would be no further deliberation, no additional arguments, no dramatic last-minute reversals. The case was over. Ivanka Trump had won. For a moment, no one moved. The journalists, so quick to scribble down notes at every twist and turn, sat frozen in their seats, their pens hovering just above their notepads. The jury, which had spent the past days absorbing every detail, every piece of evidence, every argument, exchanged cautious glances as if waiting for some last-minute clarification. The prosecutor, once so sure of his victory, remained standing at his table, his jaw clenched, his hands resting on the documents that had now become meaningless. Ivanka did not gloat. She did not exhale in relief or flash a triumphant smile. She simply stood there, composed as ever, as if this outcome had been inevitable from the moment she walked into the courtroom. Slowly, she gathered the papers in front of her, stacking them with careful precision before slipping them into her briefcase. The judge rapped his gavel once. "This court is adjourned." The sudden noise seemed to break whatever spell had fallen over the room. Chairs scraped against the polished floor as the jury began to rise, their duty fulfilled. Journalists jolted back into motion, their hands flying across their notepads, their phones lighting up as they rushed to be the first to report the outcome. Lawyers from both sides exchanged brief, silent looks, some filled with grudging respect, others with quiet resignation. The prosecutor, still standing, exhaled sharply before snapping his folder shut. He turned toward Ivanka, his expression a careful mask of professionalism, but the frustration in his eyes was undeniable. "You were never supposed to win this," he muttered under his breath. Ivanka regarded him for a moment before responding, her voice quiet but firm. "I didn't win," she said. "You lost." She turned away before he could reply, slipping the handle of her briefcase over her arm as she strode toward the courtroom doors. The moment she stepped outside, a wall of flashing lights and microphones descended upon her. Reporters shouted over one another, their questions colliding into an incomprehensible frenzy of noise. Cameras clicked in rapid succession, the bright bursts of light reflecting off the glass doors behind her. "Miss Trump, how do you feel about today's verdict? Do you think this case was politically motivated? What do you say to those who claim you manipulated the legal system to your advantage?" Ivanka paused just long enough to slide on a pair of sunglasses, the lenses dark and impenetrable. A small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of her lips as she spoke. "Feels like logic did its job." She didn't wait for a follow-up. She stepped past the microphones, past the flashing lights, past the eager journalists desperate for more. The questions continued to be thrown at her, but she paid them no mind. The trial was over. The conversation, however, was only just beginning. By the time she reached the waiting black SUV, the headlines were already being written. "Ivanka Trump shocks legal system with courtroom victory. Legal genius or system manipulator? The debate over Trump's defense. How one woman took on the law and won." In political circles, discussions erupted almost immediately. Legal analysts debated the trial on live television, dissecting every move, every argument, every counterpoint. Some called it a masterclass in legal strategy. Others saw it as a troubling sign of how the wealthy could exploit the system to their advantage. But one thing was clear. Ivanka Trump had forced the legal world to confront its own inconsistencies. Across corporate boardrooms, executives and legal teams took note. If she could dismantle a case built against her with such precision, what did that mean for other high-profile financial investigations? How many other regulations were as flawed as the ones she had exposed? How many companies had been punished under laws that contradicted themselves? The judge, who had begun the trial with amusement, now found himself facing a more complicated reality. He had expected another routine case, another high-profile defendant using weak arguments to delay the inevitable. Instead, he had been forced to acknowledge the flaws in the very system he had sworn to uphold. In a rare moment of candor, he admitted to a reporter days later, "She didn't just defend herself, she forced us to rethink everything." But Ivanka had already moved on. The victory wasn't something she needed to celebrate. It wasn't a moment for grand declarations or self-congratulatory speeches. It was simply another day, another challenge met, another system navigated with precision. As the SUV pulled away from the courthouse, leaving the chaos of reporters and flashing lights behind, she glanced down at her phone. Messages flooded in. Some congratulatory, others filled with disbelief or outrage. She ignored most of them, scrolling past them with practiced indifference. The legal battle was over. The public debate would rage on. But for Ivanka Trump, it was just another Tuesday. Subscribe.